My name is Nathan, and last Christmas, I walked into my vacation lake house to find my brother hosting a family reunion without my permission. When I asked what was happening, my mother smiled and said, "We thought we'd surprise you with a family gathering at our summer place." Our summer place? I had paid for every dollar of this property myself. Later that night, I overheard my brother telling our cousin, "Nathan doesn't even use this place much. We're actually doing him a favor by maintaining it." I quietly retreated to the guest bedroom of my own house, but I knew something had to change. What they didn't know was that I had been silently covering the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs for years without a word of acknowledgement. The revelation that followed would permanently transform our family dynamic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I purchased the lake house in Cedar Springs 5 years ago, after receiving a substantial promotion at Meridian Financial Group, where I'd worked since graduating college. The property wasn't extravagant, a 3-bedroom cabin with weathered cedar siding and a deck that extended over the water, but it represented something significant to me. Tangible proof of my hard work and financial discipline. Growing up, in a household where money was perpetually tight, had shaped my relationship with finances. My parents, Thomas and Eleanor Reynolds, were loving in their own way, but struggled with consistent employment. My father bounced between construction jobs while my mother worked part-time at the local elementary school cafeteria. My older brother Marcus, who was 4 years my senior, had always been the family favorite. Charismatic, athletic, and popular. Everything I wasn't as the quieter, more studious sibling. When I received my acceptance letter to State University with a partial scholarship, my parents' response was underwhelming. "That's nice, but how will you pay for the rest?" my father asked, making it clear that financial assistance wasn't forthcoming. Meanwhile, when Marcus decided to attend community college, my parents somehow found enough money to cover his books and fees. I worked 2 jobs throughout college, mornings at the campus bookstore and evenings waiting tables at a local restaurant. I graduated with honors, minimal student debt, and a position at Meridian Financial waiting for me. The starting salary wasn't impressive, but the growth potential was substantial for those willing to put in the effort. For 7 years, I lived modestly in a small apartment, driving the same used Honda I'd purchased in college. While friends and colleagues upgraded their lifestyles with each promotion, I continued saving aggressively. My goal was clear: financial independence and security, something I'd never experienced growing up. When I found the lake house listing online, something resonated immediately. The property needed work, but the location was ideal: a 2-hour drive from the city, situated on a quiet cove with spectacular sunset views. The realtor seemed surprised when I made a cash offer slightly below asking price, which the owners accepted within 24 hours. "Most vacation properties around here are family purchases or retirement investments," she remarked while handing me the keys. "It's unusual to see someone your age buying solo." Over the next year, I spent weekends and vacation days renovating the place, replacing the outdated kitchen, refinishing hardwood floors, and rebuilding the deck. The work was therapeutic, providing a welcome contrast to my numbers-focused career. By the time I finished the major renovations, the property's value had increased substantially, though that had never been my primary motivation. The first holiday season after completing the renovations, I invited my family to spend Christmas at the lake house. My parents arrived with Marcus, his wife Vanessa, and their 2 children, Emma and Jacob. I had prepared everything, decorated a tree, stocked the refrigerator, and even purchased gifts for my niece and nephew. "This is quite a place," my father commented, surveying the great room with its vaulted ceiling and stone fireplace. There was an undertone to his voice I couldn't quite identify, something between admiration and resentment. "Nathan always did. Know how to save $1, my mother added with a tight smile. Remember how he used to count his birthday money and never spend it? The comment stung more than it should have. What they had interpreted as miserliness had been a child's attempt at creating security in an unpredictable environment. That first Christmas set a pattern for family visits. My parents and Marcus's family would accept invitations to the lake house, but there was always an undercurrent of entitlement in their interactions with the property. They would arrive with minimal contributions to meals or expenses, leave bedroom doors open with lights blazing, and depart without helping clean up. "You can afford it," became their reflexive response whenever I mentioned sharing costs for groceries or suggested they might help with dishes after dinner. Still, I valued having family connections and continued extending invitations for major holidays and summer weekends. When my nephew Jacob developed an interest in fishing, I purchased equipment and spent hours teaching him on the dock. When Emma showed artistic promise, I converted the small sunroom into an art space with proper lighting and supplies. 2 years after purchasing the property, I received a promotion that required extensive travel. My time at the lake house became more sporadic, limited to occasional weekends and holiday breaks. During one of my longer absences, a 3-month project in our Singapore office, Marcus called with what he presented as a helpful suggestion. "Since you're barely using the lake house, why don't we take the kids up there for a few weeks this summer? We'll keep an eye on the place for you." The request seemed reasonable, and I agreed, providing they respected the property and followed a few basic guidelines I'd established. No smoking indoors, clean up thoroughly, and secure everything before leaving. When I returned from Singapore, I drove directly to the lake house, eager for some quiet recovery time after months of intense work and jet lag. What I found left me speechless. Cigarette burns on the deck railing, food-encrusted dishes piled in the sink, empty beer bottles scattered across the lawn, and a mysterious stain on the living room sofa. I called Marcus immediately. "Oh yeah, meant to tell you about that," he said casually. "We had a few friends up for the 4th of July. Might have gotten a little out of hand, but nothing major. By the way, the water heater was acting up while we were there." I spent my recovery weekend cleaning and making repairs. The water heater, which had been functioning perfectly, needed to be replaced after someone had adjusted the temperature to its maximum setting, causing it to overheat and fail. Despite my frustration, I avoided direct confrontation. Our parents had always made it clear that maintaining family harmony was paramount, particularly accommodating Marcus, who they described as having a sensitive temperament. Throughout childhood, this had translated to me yielding to his preferences, accepting blame for conflicts, and pretending not to notice when my possessions disappeared into his room. Over the next 3 years, a concerning pattern developed. Marcus would request use of the lake house with increasing frequency and diminishing notice. My parents began referring to it as the family lake house in conversations. Belongings I stored there, fishing equipment, kitchenware, even personal items like sweatshirts and books, would mysteriously disappear or be damaged beyond repair. "The kids probably moved it," was the standard explanation, even for items that had clearly been deliberately removed or replaced. I began noting disturbing changes to the property: furniture rearranged or replaced with pieces I didn't recognize, walls repainted in colors I hadn't chosen, and landscaping alterations made without consultation. When I questioned these changes, the responses were consistently dismissive. "We thought the blue paint was depressing," my mother explained about my carefully selected slate blue bedroom walls, now covered in a glaring yellow. "This brightens the space so much more." "That old coffee table didn't match anything," Marcus said about the handcrafted piece I'd commissioned from a local artisan, now nowhere to be found. "Vanessa picked up this one at a yard sale. Much more practical." With each unauthorized modification, I felt my connection to the space diminishing. The lake house, once my personal sanctuary, was being systematically transformed without my consent, my preferences disregarded as irrelevant in the face of family consensus. Yet even as my family exercised increasing control over the property's appearance and use, they contributed nothing to its upkeep. Property taxes, insurance premiums, utility bills, and maintenance costs remained exclusively my responsibility. When the roof developed a leak after a particularly severe winter storm, it was my emergency fund that covered the $7,000 repair bill. When the county reassessed property values, raising the annual tax burden by nearly 30%, it was my budget that absorbed the increase. Not once did anyone offer to contribute financially, even as they criticized aspects of the property they felt needed improvement. "The kitchen appliances are looking dated," my mother would comment, or, "This dock really should be extended another 10 feet for better fishing," my father would suggest, always with the unspoken expectation that I would fund these desired enhancements. I had created this situation through my own reluctance to establish clear boundaries, allowing their sense of entitlement to grow unchecked. The pattern felt disturbingly familiar, the same dynamic that had characterized my childhood, with my needs and preferences subordinated to maintain an artificial family harmony. But as I stood in the transformed great room that December evening, watching my extended family celebrate in a space they now clearly considered their own, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The quiet, accommodating Nathan, who had silently absorbed boundary violations to keep the peace, was receding. In his place, emerging slowly but with gathering conviction, was someone prepared to reclaim what was rightfully his. Not just the physical property, but the respect that had been conspicuously absent from these relationships for too long. The catalyst for this transformation arrived unexpectedly the following morning, through an innocuous question from my 10-year-old niece as she helped me prepare breakfast. "Uncle Nathan," Emma asked, arranging bacon on a baking sheet, "why did Daddy say you need to share the lake house better? Isn't it your house?" The simple inquiry crystallized everything. Through a child's uncomplicated perspective, the fundamental absurdity of the situation became impossible to ignore. It was indeed my house, purchased with my money, maintained with my resources. Yet I had somehow become a guest in my own space, expected to be grateful for whatever limited access and agency my family deigned to grant me. It was time for things to change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That morning at the lake house marked the beginning of my transformation. After serving breakfast to my family, I retreated to the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the winter sun sparkle across the water's surface. Emma's innocent question had pierced through years of conditioned compliance. "Isn't it your house?" The simplicity of her inquiry demanded an equally simple answer. Yes, it was my house. And it was time I started acting like it. I had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who compromised to avoid conflict. This pattern established in childhood had followed me into adulthood, morphing from a survival strategy into a habitual response that undermined my self-respect. As I sat on the dock, I realized my financial success had outpaced my emotional growth. I had built wealth while still carrying the same accommodating mindset of the child who had learned to disappear rather than disturb the family ecosystem. The tax bill for the property lay folded in my jacket pocket. The quarterly statement had arrived the previous week, showing the substantial sum due in January. For 5 years, I had silently handled these payments without comment or complaint, allowing my family to enjoy the benefits of ownership without any of its responsibilities. This arrangement had seemed easier than confrontation, but it had created an unsustainable imbalance that was eroding my connection to a place I loved. My decision crystallized in that moment. I would reclaim my property, not just legally. It had always been mine on paper, but psychologically and emotionally. This wasn't about denying my family access to the lake house. It was about establishing proper boundaries and expectations that reflected reality, rather than enabling a comfortable fiction. As I returned to the house, I noticed Marcus and my father on the newly furnished screened porch. Patio furniture I didn't recognize had appeared since my last visit. They were discussing plans for a dock expansion in the spring, speaking with the confident authority of property owners rather than guests. "We should look into getting a boat lift installed too," Marcus was saying. "Jacob's getting old enough to help with a small fishing boat." "Good idea," my father agreed. "Nothing fancy, just something practical for getting out to the deeper water. Nathan can handle the installation costs. He's doing well enough with that promotion." I paused in the doorway, unseen by either of them. Previously, I might have silently noted their presumption and added boat lift research to my mental to-do list. Now I felt something different stirring, not anger exactly, but a calm, clear certainty about what needed to change. That evening, after dinner, I announced I had something important to discuss with everyone. My mother immediately looked concerned, while Marcus appeared mildly irritated at the interruption to the football game he'd been watching on my recently upgraded television system. "Is everything okay, honey?" My mother perched on the edge of the sofa. "You're not sick, are you?" "I'm perfectly healthy," I assured her. "This is about the lake house, specifically how we've been handling its use and maintenance." "What's there to discuss?" Marcus interjected. "System works fine. We help keep an eye on the place when you're busy with work. You get to share it with family. Win-win." I took a deliberate breath before continuing. "Actually, there's been a significant imbalance I need to address. I've been solely responsible for all costs associated with this property: mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities, and repairs, while increasingly having less say in how it's used or maintained." "Well, you can afford it," my father said dismissively, the familiar refrain that had justified countless one-sided arrangements throughout my adult life. "My financial capability isn't the issue," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "This is about respect and fairness. I've noticed a pattern where my property is being treated as communal, with decisions made without my input or consent, while the financial burden remains exclusively mine." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Vanessa shifted in her seat. Looking genuinely surprised, I wondered briefly what version of our arrangement Marcus had shared with her. "What exactly are you saying?" My mother's tone carried a warning edge I recognized from childhood confrontations. "I'm saying that moving forward, we need a clear understanding about the lake house. It is my property, purchased with my savings, and maintained with my income. I'm happy to share it with family, but with some important changes." I outlined my new terms: a shared calendar for scheduling visits rather than assumptions about availability, contribution to utilities during stays, restoration of my authority regarding property modifications, and basic respect for the space, including proper cleaning before departure. "You can't be serious," Marcus scoffed. "After everything this family has done for you?" "What exactly has the family done for me regarding this property?" I asked, quietly. "We've kept it occupied when you're too busy with your precious career to enjoy it," my mother interjected. "Empty houses deteriorate faster. Everyone knows that." "I appreciate the intention," I said, "but that doesn't address the fundamental imbalance. This isn't about excluding anyone. It's about establishing appropriate boundaries." "Boundaries?" My father practically spat the word. "We're family." "There aren't supposed to be boundaries." His statement illuminated so much about our family dynamic: the insistence on enmeshment disguised as closeness, the resistance to individual autonomy labeled as disloyalty. It was the philosophy that had kept me silent and compliant for decades. "Healthy families respect each other's boundaries," I countered. "They don't take without asking or assume without confirming. This is about the water heater, isn't it?" Marcus rolled his eyes. "One little mishap and you're ready to lock us all out." It's not about any single incident, I explained, maintaining my composure despite the familiar attempt to minimize legitimate concerns. It's about a pattern that needs correction. I value sharing this place with all of you, but the current arrangement isn't sustainable. So what happens if we don't agree to your terms? My mother's voice had the tight, controlled quality that historically preceded emotional withdrawal, her most effective tool for enforcing compliance. Then I'll need to reconsider the open access approach we've been operating under, I answered, truthfully. I'm not threatening to ban anyone, but I am stating that things need to change. The discussion deteriorated predictably from there. Accusations of selfishness, reminders of familial obligation, and emotional appeals designed to re-establish the status quo. Marcus stormed out to the deck, while my mother retreated to her bedroom, a tactical withdrawal I recognized from childhood disagreements. My father lingered after the others dispersed, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You've changed," he finally said. "I've grown," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." Later that night, as the house quieted, Vanessa approached me in the kitchen where I was preparing my lunch for the following day's drive back to the city. "I had no idea you were covering all the expenses for this place," she admitted, leaning against the counter. "Marcus always implied it was some kind of family inheritance property that you were managing." Her candor surprised me. "It's not," I confirmed. "I purchased it outright 5 years ago." "Including the tax bills?" she pressed. I nodded, retrieving the folded statement from my pocket and placing it on the counter between us. Her eyes widened slightly at the figure. "I assumed everyone was contributing," she said quietly. "The way they talk about our lake house." "I'm sorry, Nathan. That's not right." Her acknowledgement, simple as it was, felt like the first honest response I'd received all evening. "Thank you for saying that." "For what it's worth," she added, "I'll talk to Marcus. He can be stubborn, but he's not unreasonable when he actually understands the situation." I appreciated her intention but harbored realistic expectations about its impact. Patterns established over decades don't dissolve with a single conversation, however clarifying. What mattered more was my internal shift, the decision to value my own boundaries regardless of external validation or approval. The following morning, I departed earlier than planned, leaving a detailed note outlining checkout procedures and a reminder of the discussion we'd had. As I drove away, watching the lake house recede in my rearview mirror, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for the inevitable relationship turbulence ahead, anxiety about enforcing boundaries with people accustomed to their absence, but predominantly a profound sense of rightness. The real test would come in the implementation, maintaining my resolve when faced with the familiar pressure tactics that had historically been so effective. But something fundamental had shifted within me. I was no longer the compliant younger brother desperate for family approval or the conflict-avoidant son prioritizing artificial harmony over authentic relationships. As I merged onto the highway toward the city, I realized that reclaiming my property was about something far more significant than real estate. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, my self-respect, and my right to define the terms of my own life, even when those terms contradicted others' expectations or convenience. The road ahead would undoubtedly contain challenges, but for the first time in my adult life, I was driving it on my own terms. 3 weeks passed before I heard from any family member regarding the lake house. The silence wasn't unexpected. Emotional withdrawal had always been my family's preferred method for expressing disapproval. I used this time productively, consulting with my attorney to establish a formal usage agreement for the property and meeting with a local property manager who could oversee maintenance and monitor access. The first communication came from an unexpected source. My niece Emma sent a carefully printed letter in purple marker, delivered to my city apartment. "Dear Uncle Nathan," she wrote, "I miss the art room at the lake. Dad says we can't go there anymore because you're being selfish. Are you mad at us? Love, Emma. Her innocent inquiry cut through the adult complexity, highlighting the collateral damage of family conflict. I called Emma that evening, reassuring her that she was always welcome at the lake house, particularly to use the art room I had created specifically for her. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things, I explained, but that doesn't change how much I care about you. Dad says you don't want to share anymore, she replied, her voice small. It's not about not wanting to share, I clarified. It's about making sure everyone understands and respects that the lake house is my responsibility. Kind of like how your dollhouse is yours, even though you let Jacob play with it sometimes. But I don't let him change the furniture without asking, she said with sudden certainty. Exactly, I agreed, marveling at how children could often distill complex situations to their essential truth. Later that week, my phone lit up with Marcus's number. I answered with cautious optimism, hoping Vanessa had successfully conveyed the reality of the situation. We need to talk about this lake house situation, he began without preamble. The kids keep asking when we're going back. I'm glad you called, I responded. I've been working on a formal usage agreement that I think addresses everyone's interests. A usage agreement? He scoffed. We're family, not tenants. This isn't about treating anyone like tenants, I explained patiently. It's about establishing clear expectations so everyone feels respected. Fine, whatever. We'd like to use the place for spring break in April. Vanessa's already requested the time off work. I consulted my calendar. April would work. I'll email you the agreement so you understand the new arrangements. Is this really necessary? His tone carried the familiar mixture of irritation and dismissal that typically preceded him getting his way. Yes, it is, I replied firmly. I value sharing the lake house with family, but the previous arrangement wasn't working. After sending the agreement, which outlined reasonable expectations regarding scheduling, care of the property, and a modest utility contribution for extended stays, I received a barrage of text messages from my mother. How could you do this to your own family? Your father is devastated. Is this some kind of punishment? We've always supported you. I took a deep breath before responding. This isn't punishment, Mom. It's about establishing healthy boundaries around a property that I purchased and maintain. Everyone is still welcome to enjoy the lake house within reasonable parameters. The situation escalated the following weekend when I arrived at the lake house for some much-needed solitude after an intense work project. I discovered my parents' car in the driveway, though I had received no notification they would be there. The spare key, normally secured in a lockbox for emergency use only, had been used to access the property. Inside, I found my parents comfortably established, with evidence they had been there for several days. Groceries filled the refrigerator, their clothing occupied bedroom drawers, and several new decorative items had appeared in the living room. What a nice surprise, my mother exclaimed with artificial brightness when I entered. We didn't expect you this weekend. I didn't expect you either, I replied evenly. Especially since we just discussed the importance of communicating before using the property. We didn't think you'd mind, my father interjected. You're always saying the place sits empty too often. This deliberate misrepresentation of my position was a familiar tactic, taking a genuine concern I'd expressed and distorting it to justify disregarding my boundaries. In the past, I might have acquiesced to avoid conflict, accommodating their presence despite my need for solitude. That pattern ended today. I do mind, I stated clearly. Not because I don't want you here, but because we had explicitly discussed the need for advanced communication and scheduling. Using the emergency key to access the property without my knowledge directly contradicts what I expressed was important to me. You can't possibly expect us to leave, my mother responded, her voice rising with indignation. We're already settled in. I understand this is uncomfortable, I acknowledged. But yes, I am asking you to respect the boundaries I've established for my property. I'd be happy to coordinate a visit for another weekend when we can all plan appropriately. What followed was a familiar emotional storm: accusations of cruelty, reminders of parental sacrifice, and declarations about how I was raised to treat family. My father paced the kitchen, alternating between stony silence and abrupt pronouncements about this generation's selfishness. My mother cycled through tears, cold anger, and attempts at negotiation. Throughout this emotional barrage, I maintained a calm, consistent position. I care about you both, and I want you to enjoy this place. That hasn't changed. What needs to change is how we communicate about and respect each other's boundaries. Eventually, after realizing I wouldn't relent, they began gathering their belongings, movements deliberately slow and laden with martyred sighs. As my father loaded their car, my mother made one final attempt. "Do you know what this place means?" "To us?" she asked, gesturing toward the lake visible through the great room windows. "Your father and I could never afford anything like this on our own. Coming here has been the highlight of our retirement." Her words were designed to evoke guilt, but they instead crystallized exactly why boundaries had become necessary. The lake house had become an entitlement in their minds rather than a privilege extended by a family member who had worked hard to create it. "I understand it's important to you," I replied gently. "That's why I've never considered preventing your visits. I'm only asking for basic consideration and respect regarding how those visits happen." After they departed, the house felt unnaturally quiet. I sat on the deck with a cup of tea, watching twilight settle over the water. Confrontation had never been my natural territory, and standing firm against the emotional tactics that had previously been so effective left me drained, but also strangely peaceful. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Heard what happened with Mom and Dad? Real nice, bro. Way to respect your elders." I didn't respond immediately, recognizing the invitation into a familiar dynamic where I would defend my actions while he positioned himself as the reasonable, family-oriented son. Instead, I silenced my phone and focused on the sunset painting, the lake in shades of amber and gold. The following morning, I woke to multiple missed calls and another text from Marcus. "We need to talk about this lake house situation. Mom was up all night crying." Rather than engaging in text warfare, I called him directly. "I understand everyone's upset," I began when he answered. "But what happened yesterday was a direct contradiction of boundaries I clearly communicated." "They're in their 70s, Nathan," Marcus countered. "You can't treat elderly parents like trespassers." "I didn't treat them like trespassers," I corrected. "I treated them like adults who had disregarded an explicit request regarding my property. Their age doesn't exempt them from basic respect for boundaries. It's just a vacation house," he argued. "Is this really worth damaging your relationship with the entire family?" His framing revealed everything, characterizing my reasonable boundary enforcement as the cause of damage, rather than acknowledging that the initial boundary violation was the actual source of conflict. It was the same inverted responsibility that had characterized family dynamics throughout my life. "This isn't just about a house," I explained. "It's about establishing mutual respect as the foundation for our family relationships moving forward." "Since when did you become so concerned with respect?" His voice carried a sneer. "You never minded before." "That's exactly the point," I replied quietly. "I should have minded. We all deserve basic consideration in our relationships, including me." The conversation ended without resolution, but I felt a growing certainty about my position. This wasn't merely about property rights, but about dismantling a dysfunctional family system built on uneven expectations and one-sided accommodation. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Vanessa. "Marcus isn't telling the whole story to others. I've tried to explain your perspective, but emotions are running high. For what it's worth, I understand what you're doing and why it's necessary. This pattern needed addressing long before the lake house became an issue. Her message provided welcome validation that I wasn't imagining the imbalance that had characterized family interactions. While I hadn't undertaken this boundary-setting process seeking outside approval, knowing that at least one family member recognized the legitimacy of my position provided reassurance during a difficult transition. As the week progressed, the family communication channels fell silent again, a predictable response when initial pressure tactics failed to yield the desired result. I used this period to implement practical changes, having the locks changed, installing a security system, with camera monitoring and finalizing the formal usage agreement with my attorney. These measures weren't intended to prevent family access, but to ensure that future access would occur within the framework of mutual respect I was establishing. The cameras would provide accountability, the new locks would prevent unauthorized entry, and the agreement would clarify expectations for everyone involved. By taking these concrete steps to protect my boundaries, I was sending a clear message. My commitment to this new paradigm wasn't temporary or subject to emotional manipulation. It represented a fundamental recalibration of how I would engage with my family moving forward, with authenticity, self-respect, and the expectation of reciprocal consideration. The confrontation phase had been challenging but necessary, revealing both the depth of entrenched patterns and the possibility of healthier interactions. As difficult as these conversations had been, they represented the essential groundwork for whatever would come next, whether reconciliation based on mutual respect or continued distance if that respect proved impossible to establish. February brought unusually heavy snowfall to the lake region. I received an automated alert from the security system I'd installed, notifying me of a power outage at the property. With a major work presentation scheduled for the following day, I couldn't immediately drive out to check on things, so I contacted Trevor, the local property manager I'd hired, to assess the situation. "It's not looking great," Trevor reported, after his inspection. "Power's been out for about 18 hours. The backup generator kicked in but ran out of fuel. Temperature inside is hovering around 40 degrees. If it drops much further, you'll risk pipe damage." "Can you refill the generator and get things stabilized?" I asked. "Already on it," he assured me. "But there's something else you should know." The county tax assessor left an urgent notice on the door. Apparently, there's been confusion about property tax payments. This was concerning. I had always paid the property taxes promptly, setting up automatic payments through my bank to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. Did the notice give any specific details? Just says there's a discrepancy that needs immediate attention, and provides a contact number for the county assessor's office. After my presentation the following day, I called the number. The assessor's clerk, a woman named Dorothy with a no-nonsense tone, pulled up my property records. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, we've been trying to reach you regarding your lake property. There appears to be a situation with duplicate tax payments." "Duplicate payments?" I repeated, confused. "That's correct. For the past 3 years, we've received 2 separate payments for your property taxes each quarter. One from your bank's automatic payment system, and another check from Thomas Reynolds with a note specifying the lake house property." My father had been paying the property taxes? This made no sense. "There must be some mistake," I said. "My father doesn't have any financial responsibility for the property." "Well, he's been sending payments consistently for 3 years," Dorothy replied. "When duplicate payments occur, our system automatically credits the excess to the next quarter. Your account currently has a substantial credit balance." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing to make sense of this revelation. Why would my father secretly pay property taxes on a home I owned without ever mentioning it? It contradicted everything I understood about our family dynamic and financial relationship. After confirming my presentation had been well received, I took a personal day and drove to the lake house. The property was secure, with Trevor having successfully restored power and heat. I spent the morning checking for any cold weather damage before driving to my parents' house in Mapleton, the small town where I'd grown up. Their modest ranch-style home looked much as it always had. The same faded blue shutters, the same concrete birdbath my mother had painted with wildflowers decades ago. I knocked rather than using my key, suddenly feeling like a visitor rather than a returning son. My mother answered, her surprise at seeing me quickly masked by a cool reserve. "This is unexpected. Your father's at his physical therapy appointment." "I can wait," I said. "There's something important I need to discuss with both of you." She reluctantly invited me in, maintaining the emotional distance established after our confrontation at the lake house. We sat in uncomfortable silence, making stilted conversation about the weather and her garden club activities until my father's car pulled into the driveway. He entered using his walker, a concession to knee replacement surgery he'd undergone the previous year, and stopped abruptly when he saw me. "Nathan?" he acknowledged with a nod, neither warm nor entirely cold. "Dad," I returned the greeting. "I need to ask you about something important." After he settled into his recliner, I continued. "I received a call from the county tax assessor's office yesterday. They informed me that you've been paying property taxes on the lake house for the past 3 years. Is that true?" My mother's sharp intake of breath and quick glance toward my father confirmed that this wasn't news to her. My father's expression remained impassive, though his hands gripped the armrests of his chair more tightly. "It's my contribution," he finally said, his voice gruff. "Your contribution? Dad, you've never mentioned this. All these years I thought I was solely responsible for all expenses related to the property." "You don't need to know everything," he replied. "Some things a father does without announcement." I tried to reconcile this secret financial support with his vocal criticism of my boundary setting. "But you've been so resistant to the usage agreement, acting as though I'm being unreasonable for asking for basic consideration regarding a property I maintain." "The agreement isn't the issue," my mother interjected. "It's the way you suddenly changed everything without discussion. After all these years of sharing the lake house freely, you imposed rules overnight." "Because I felt taken advantage of," I explained. "I believed I was carrying the entire financial burden while having decreasing say in how the property was used." "You weren't carrying the entire burden," my father stated firmly. "I've been handling the taxes since you bought the place. But why keep that a secret from me?" My father shifted uncomfortably, looking almost embarrassed. "You were so determined to do everything on your own. So proud of managing it all independently. I didn't want to take that from you." His explanation struck me as both touching and troubling. There was genuine care in his desire to contribute, but also a concerning lack of transparency that had contributed to our current conflict. "Dad, I appreciate the financial support, truly. But secrets like this create misunderstandings. I've been operating under the assumption that I was solely responsible for everything related to the lake house, which affected how I viewed certain behaviors." "Like what?" my mother asked defensively. "Like rearranging furniture without asking, repainting rooms, or accessing the property without notice," I explained. "Those actions felt particularly disrespectful when I believed I was the only one investing in the property's upkeep." My father looked down at his hands. "I didn't pay the taxes to earn partial ownership rights. I did it because I could finally help you with something substantial. After all those years, we couldn't provide much support." This revelation added layers of complexity to the situation. My father's secret contributions came from a place of parental care and perhaps atonement for previous limitations. Yet the lack of communication had contributed to the very conflict we were now navigating. "I wish you had told me," I said softly. "We could have acknowledged your contribution while still establishing clear expectations about how the property is used." "Would that have changed anything?" my mother asked. "Would you still have insisted on all these new rules and restrictions?" They're not restrictions, Mom. They're boundaries, expectations for mutual respect. And yes, I would still have asked for advance notice before visits and consultation before making changes to the property. But perhaps the conversation would have happened differently if I'd understood the full picture. We sat in silence for several moments, each processing this new information from our own perspective. Finally, my father spoke. When you were 10, you wanted a bicycle like the one Marcus had received for his birthday. We couldn't afford another one that year. Do you remember what you did? I nodded, the memory surfacing clearly. I delivered newspapers for 6 months to save up for it. You never complained, he continued. Never asked us again after we said no. Just figured out how to get what you needed on your own. I was proud of your determination, but I also felt like I'd failed you, that a child shouldn't have to work that hard for something so basic. His voice grew quieter. When you bought that lake house with cash, no mortgage, no loans, it reminded me of that bicycle. You'd done it entirely on your own again, without asking for help that probably wouldn't have come anyway. Paying the taxes was my way of finally contributing to something important to you, even if you didn't know it. My mother reached for his hand, her earlier defensiveness softening. Your father wanted to help without diminishing your accomplishment. We should have told you, but pride gets complicated in families. For the first time, I glimpsed their perspective more clearly. Their pride in my achievements mingled with regret for past limitations, their desire to contribute within their means, and perhaps their need to feel entitled to the one luxury space their son had created. It didn't excuse boundary violations, but it provided context I had been missing. I think we've all been operating with incomplete information, I acknowledged. Dad, I'm genuinely grateful for your contribution to the taxes. It means a lot that you wanted to support me in that way. Does this change anything about your rules? My mother asked, a hint of hope in her voice. The fundamental need for mutual respect and clear communication doesn't change, I replied truthfully. But knowing about Dad's contribution does help me understand your perspective better. Perhaps we can revisit the agreement with this new understanding and find terms that acknowledge both my ownership responsibilities and your ongoing connection to the property. My father nodded slowly. Reasonable boundaries aren't the problem. It was feeling suddenly excluded from a place that had become important to us, like we'd lost standing in your life. You haven't lost standing, I assured him. If anything, I'm trying to establish a healthier relationship with everyone. One, based on honest communication rather than unspoken expectations and assumptions. As I drove back to the lake house that evening, I reflected on how this unexpected revelation had shifted my perspective. My father's secret contribution didn't negate my need for boundaries, but it did illuminate the complex emotional dynamics underlying our conflict. The issue had never been simply about property rights or financial responsibility. It was about recognition, communication, and the challenging transition from old family patterns to more transparent relationships. The tax revelation hadn't solved everything, but it had opened a door to more honest dialogue. For perhaps the first time, we had glimpsed each other's authentic motivations, rather than reacting to perceived slights or assumed intentions. It was a small but significant step toward the kind of mutual respect I had been seeking all along. Back at the lake house, I walked out onto the dock despite the winter chill, watching moonlight create a silver path across the dark water. The property remained mine, in legal ownership, financial responsibility, and personal significance. But I now understood that it also held meaning for my family beyond mere convenience or entitlement. Finding the balance between honoring those connections and maintaining healthy boundaries would require ongoing effort from all of us. The path forward wouldn't be simple, but at least we were beginning to acknowledge the actual landscape we were navigating rather than the assumed territory that had led to our collision. In that acknowledgement lay the possibility of genuine resolution, rather than merely temporary peace. March arrived with the first tentative signs of spring, patches of snow giving way to revealed dormant grass, and occasional days warm enough to sit on the deck with just a light jacket. I had been spending more weekends at the lake house, partly to oversee some minor renovations, but mostly to reconnect with the property that had become the focal point of so much family tension. The revelation about my father's tax contributions had created space for more honest communication, though progress remained slow and occasionally uncomfortable. I had revised the usage agreement, acknowledging their financial contribution while still maintaining clear expectations about scheduling and property care. The document now included a formal recognition of my father's role in covering the property taxes, making visible what had previously been hidden. One Saturday morning, as I was replacing some weathered boards on the dock, a familiar SUV pulled into the driveway. Marcus stepped out, alone, a departure from his usual family entourage. He stood awkwardly by his vehicle for a moment before approaching, carrying what appeared to be a toolbox. "Trevor mentioned you were doing dock repairs," he said by way of greeting. "Thought you might want an extra pair of hands." This unexpected olive branch surprised me. Marcus had been the most openly resistant to the changes I'd implemented, positioning himself as the defender of family traditions against my unreasonable demands. His presence now, without Vanessa, or the children to buffer potential tension, suggested a deliberate choice to engage directly. "I could use some help," I acknowledged, gesturing toward the pile of cedar planks waiting to be cut. "These old boards have seen better days." We worked side by side for nearly an hour before either of us broached the underlying tension. The physical activity provided a neutral context for being together, allowing a gradual easing of the strained atmosphere that had characterized our recent interactions. "Dad told me about the tax payments," Marcus finally said, securing a plank while I drove in the screws. "That was unexpected." "For both of us," I agreed. "It certainly complicated the narrative." Marcus nodded, his focus ostensibly on the task at hand, though his furrowed brow suggested deeper contemplation. "Vanessa thinks our family has communication issues. Apparently that's not normal. Keeping important information from each other and expecting everyone to just magically understand what's going on." The understatement was so profound it startled a laugh from me. "She might be onto something." "There." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Look, I'm not good at this emotional processing stuff, but Vanessa made me realize that maybe I've been territorial about the lake house without acknowledging what it actually took for you to create this place." "I never wanted to exclude anyone," I said. "I just needed some basic consideration." "Yeah, well," he shrugged, reaching for another board. "Consideration hasn't exactly been our family's strong suit, has it? Especially with you." This candid acknowledgement of the dynamic I'd struggled with for years caught me off guard. Marcus had always been the center of the family constellation, the sun around which everyone orbited. His recognition of the imbalance represented a shift I hadn't anticipated. "What brought on this insight?" I asked. Marcus measured a board, marked it carefully, then set down his pencil. "Emma, actually. She asked why adults make things so complicated. Said you told her the lake house was like her dollhouse. Hers to share but not for others to change without permission. Made perfect sense to her." He resumed measuring before continuing. "Then last week, Vanessa's brother stayed at our house, while we were on that college tour with Jacob. Rearranged our living room furniture because he thought it would flow better. I was furious. Vanessa pointed out the irony, that I was reacting exactly the way you did about the lake house changes. This parallel experience had apparently created an opening for empathy that my words alone couldn't achieve. Sometimes, understanding requires the visceral experience of walking in another's shoes, even briefly. "So where does that leave us?" I asked. "Honestly, I'm not sure." Marcus secured another board. The agreement you sent makes sense, even if I didn't want to admit it initially. Having actual guidelines beats navigating unspoken expectations, but it still feels formal for family. I understand that, I acknowledged. But maybe we needed something formal to correct the imbalance that developed informally. Over time, as new patterns establish, perhaps we won't need such explicit structures. We completed the dock repairs by mid-afternoon, the physical labor creating a shared accomplishment that subtly shifted our interaction toward something resembling our pre-conflict relationship. As we packed up the tools, Marcus gestured toward the house. Emma's art competition is in 2 weeks. She's been working on a landscape of the lake, based on the view from the sunroom you set up for her. Would it be all right if we came out next weekend so she can finish it? Following the proper scheduling protocol, of course. His slight smile took any potential sting from the last comment. I'd like that, I replied. The art supplies are fully stocked, and Trevor refreshed the pastels she likes last month. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. You kept the art room set up? Even with everything that happened? Of course. That space was created specifically for Emma. The issues between the adults never had anything to do with my relationship with her or Jacob. As Marcus prepared to leave, he hesitated before asking, "What about Mom and Dad? Where do they fit in all this now?" "We're talking," I said simply. "It's complicated, but we're trying to establish something healthier than what came before." Dad's contribution to the taxes was his way of supporting me, even if the secrecy created problems. There's genuine care there, just expressed through some dysfunctional patterns that need reshaping. After Marcus departed, I sat on the newly repaired dock, taking in the tranquil lake surface now mostly free of ice. The conversation had been unexpected, but represented exactly the kind of honest exchange I had hoped might eventually emerge from the boundary-setting process. Not immediate harmony, but authentic engagement with the actual issues rather than reaction to perceived slights. The following Thursday, I received a call from my mother. Her initial awkwardness gradually gave way to the real purpose of her contact. "Your father and I have been talking about the summer. We'd like to spend 2 weeks at the lake in July, following your scheduling system, of course. But we were wondering." She hesitated before continuing. "We'd like to host a small gathering for your father's birthday that first weekend. Nothing elaborate, just family and a few close friends. Given the new arrangements, we wanted to ask permission rather than assume." The request itself wasn't surprising. My father's birthday had often been celebrated at the lake house in previous years. What was new was the explicit acknowledgement that permission was required, a recognition of my authority regarding the property that had previously been conspicuously absent. "I think that would be wonderful," I replied. "His birthday deserves a proper celebration." "Thank you," she said, relief evident in her voice. "We'll handle all the arrangements and costs, of course." "I appreciate that, but I'd like to contribute as well. It's an important milestone." There was a pause before she continued. "Nathan, there's something else. Your father and I have been reflecting on how we've approached the lake house situation, and perhaps our relationship with you more generally. We didn't recognize how our behavior might have felt dismissive of your boundaries." This acknowledgement, however tentatively expressed, represented significant progress. My mother had always been the emotional gatekeeper of the family, defining acceptable feelings and responses. Her recognition of my perspective, even partially, suggested a willingness to reconsider entrenched patterns. "That means a lot to hear," I responded. "I've never wanted to restrict anyone's enjoyment of the property, just to establish mutual respect around how it's used." "We understand that better now," she said quietly. "Your father especially. He said something interesting the other day, that you were the only one who actually created something substantial for the family to enjoy, yet you were the one whose input was least considered regarding how it was treated. That doesn't seem right when stated so plainly." Her candor surprised me. My parents had rarely engaged in such direct examination of family dynamics, preferring to maintain comfortable narratives even when they contradicted observable reality. I think we're all learning, I offered. Finding the balance between sharing generously and maintaining healthy boundaries isn't straightforward, especially in families where the established patterns run deep. After scheduling their July visit through the formal system I'd established, my mother added a final thought before ending the call. The property manager, Trevor, he mentioned you're considering building a small guest cabin on the western edge of the property. Is that accurate? It's in the early planning stages, I confirmed, just exploring options at this point. Your father has some experience with that type of construction from his contracting days, she noted. He might have useful input if you're interested. The offer represented another step toward a healthier dynamic, suggesting collaboration, without presuming control, offering expertise while respecting my authority over the decision. It was a small shift, but significant in the context of our history. I'd appreciate his thoughts, I said truthfully. The preliminary drawings should be ready next month. That weekend, I returned to the lake house to find a package on the porch, delivered by Trevor, according to the notification on my phone. Inside was a framed photograph of my father and me from nearly 30 years earlier, standing proudly beside a small rowboat at this very lake, fishing poles in hand. I vaguely remembered the day, a rare father-son outing during a period when work had consumed most of his attention. Attached was a note in my father's distinctive handwriting. Found this while organizing the attic. Perhaps it belongs at the lake house now. The property might be yours, but the memories belong to all of us. Looking forward to making new ones on better terms. The gesture contained both acknowledgement and aspiration, recognition of my ownership coupled with hope for shared experiences moving forward. It represented neither complete capitulation to my position nor stubborn adherence to previous expectations, but rather an evolution toward something more balanced. I placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace, where it offered a reminder of the complex history that had brought us to this pivotal moment of potential transformation. The lake house had become more than property. It had become the vehicle through which long-established family dynamics were being examined, challenged, and potentially reconstructed on healthier foundations. As spring gradually reclaimed the landscape, I sensed a parallel renewal in these critical relationships. The process wasn't complete or perfect, but genuine progress was emerging from the difficult conversations and boundary setting that had initially created such turbulence. The path forward remained under construction, but for the first time, all parties seemed willing to contribute to building something more sustainable than what had come before. April arrived with a spectacular display of spring. Flowering trees dotted the hillsides surrounding the lake with bursts of white and pink, while daffodils and tulips emerged along the property's garden beds that I had planted 3 years earlier. The seasonal transition seemed fitting as my family relationships continued their own cautious rebirth after the difficult winter. As promised, Marcus brought Emma and Jacob to the lake house on a bright Saturday morning. I greeted them at the door, noticing immediately how Emma clutched her art portfolio protectively to her chest. "Uncle Nathan, I brought my lake painting to show you," she announced. Her previous hesitation around me completely vanished. "It's for the school art exhibition next week." "I can't wait to see it," I replied with genuine enthusiasm. "I've been looking forward to your visit." While Emma immediately headed for the art room, Jacob lingered awkwardly in the entryway. At 12, he was at that challenging age where childhood interests were being evaluated against the looming pressure of adolescent identity formation. "The fishing equipment is all ready in the boathouse," I mentioned casually. "I had the rods serviced last month." His face brightened momentarily before he caught himself, glancing toward his father as if seeking permission to show excitement. "Go ahead," Marcus encouraged. "Uncle Nathan got some new lures specifically for bass season." As Jacob hurried toward the boathouse, Marcus turned to me with a wry smile. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," I replied simply. His Interest in fishing was never part of the conflict. The day unfolded with a naturalness that had been missing from family interactions for months. Emma worked diligently in the art room while Jacob and I spent the morning on the dock, catching and releasing several impressive smallmouth bass. Marcus alternated between helping Emma with her painting and joining us for fishing, the awkwardness of our dock repair conversation giving way to more comfortable interaction. During lunch on the deck, Emma proudly displayed her nearly completed painting, a remarkably skilled rendering of the lake at sunset, capturing the distinctive silhouette of Eagle's Point against a blazing orange sky. "This is exceptional, Emma," I said, genuinely impressed by her artistic development. "You've really captured the way the light reflects off the water just before dusk." "The art room makes it easier to paint," she explained earnestly. "The light is perfect, and I can see the lake while I work." "Speaking of the art room," Marcus interjected, "we brought something to contribute." He retrieved a package from their car and handed it to me. Emma picked it out. Inside was a professional-grade adjustable easel, significantly better than the basic model I had originally provided. "We thought it could stay here permanently," Marcus explained, "since this is where Emma does her best work." The gift represented more than just art equipment. It symbolized acceptance of the new arrangement and investment in its continuation. Rather than resisting the established boundaries, they were now actively participating within the framework, enhancing the shared space while respecting its parameters. "This is perfect," I said, noticing Emma's proud smile. "It will make the art room even better for your future projects." After lunch, Marcus asked to speak with me privately while the children were occupied with their respective activities. We walked along the shoreline path I had cleared 2 summers earlier, the conversation flowing more easily than I had anticipated. "Vanessa and I have been talking," he began, "about the lake house situation and family dynamics more generally." She pointed out something I hadn't considered, that I've been approaching our relationship from a position of assumed authority, even though we're both adults. "That's an insightful observation," I acknowledged, surprised by his self-reflection. "Growing up as the older brother, I got used to certain privileges," he continued. "Decision-making power, parental attention, having my preferences prioritized. Those patterns became so normalized I never questioned them, even as we moved into adulthood." His candor was unexpected. Marcus had rarely demonstrated this level of self-awareness about our sibling dynamic. "I assumed the same entitlements extended to your property," he admitted. "That whatever you created or achieved somehow remained within the family hierarchy, where my preferences still carried greater weight. It sounds ridiculous when stated openly, but it was the unexamined assumption I was operating under. Family patterns have remarkable staying power," I observed, "even when they no longer serve us." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Vanessa says her therapy sessions have been focused on exactly that, how childhood dynamics continue influencing adult relationships until we consciously revise them." "Vanessa is in therapy?" I asked, surprised by this revelation. "Started about 6 months ago," he confirmed. "Initially for work stress, but it evolved into examining relationship patterns. She's been encouraging me to consider how our family operates and where those behaviors originated." This external perspective had apparently catalyzed reflection that might otherwise have taken years to emerge organically. Sometimes an outside viewpoint can illuminate patterns too familiar to be recognized from within. "The irony," Marcus continued, "is that I was angry about your boundary setting because it disrupted the comfortable system I benefited from. But Vanessa helped me see that the system itself was fundamentally imbalanced, especially toward you." We reached the small clearing where I'd been considering placing the guest cabin. The afternoon sun filtered through new spring leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the ground that seemed to shift with each gentle breeze. "I'm planning to build a small guest cabin here," I shared, gesturing toward the clearing. 1 bedroom, basic kitchen, private bath, a space where family could stay while still maintaining some separation from the main house. That sounds ideal, Marcus replied, studying the location, especially as the kids get older and value more independence. My thought exactly. I want them to always feel welcome here, particularly as they transition into adulthood. I hesitated before adding, the property will likely go to them eventually. I want it to serve the next generation without carrying forward the complications we've experienced. This was the first time I'd articulated my long-term intentions for the property, though they had been forming in my mind for some time. The lake house represented not just my achievement, but a potential legacy, something of value to pass forward, hopefully with healthier associations than those that had characterized its early history. Marcus looked genuinely moved by this revelation. You've really thought about the future of this place, haven't you? It's always been more than just a vacation property to me, I acknowledged. It represents something I created from nothing, a tangible manifestation of values that matter. To me, beauty, tranquility, connection to nature, space for creativity and reflection. Those are worth preserving, Marcus agreed quietly, and worth respecting in the present. When we returned to the house, Emma proudly announced she had completed her painting and wanted to leave it at the lake house until after the competition. It belongs here, she declared with the certainty only a child can muster, since this is where I made it. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly, with Jacob proudly teaching me a new fishing knot he'd learned at summer camp and Emma arranging her art supplies meticulously before departure. As they prepared to leave, Marcus surprised me with a proposal. We've been thinking about the 4th of July, he said. Usually we all crowd into the main house, which gets chaotic. What if this year Vanessa and I rented one of those cabin tents and set it up on the flat area near the fire pit? The kids would love the camping experience, and it would reduce the pressure on the house itself. This suggestion represented a meaningful evolution, acknowledging the limitations of the space while finding solutions that respected everyone's needs rather than simply assuming accommodation. It indicated not just acceptance of the new boundaries, but active participation in maintaining them constructively. That's an excellent idea, I agreed. We could set up a proper camping area with a dedicated fire pit for s'mores. The kids would have their adventure while still having access to facilities in the main house as needed. As they drove away, with Emma waving enthusiastically out the back window, I reflected on how significantly the situation had evolved in just a few months. What had begun as a painful confrontation was gradually transforming into something potentially stronger than the relationship that had preceded it, one built on explicit communication and mutual respect, rather than unexamined assumptions and one-sided accommodation. Later that week, my father called to discuss the preliminary drawings for the guest cabin I had mentioned to my mother. Rather than launching directly into opinions or suggestions, he began by asking questions about my vision for the space and the specific needs it would address. This consultation approach, respectful of my authority while offering his expertise, reflected the evolving nature of our relationship. I've been thinking about your foundation plans, he said after reviewing the drawings I had emailed. Given the soil composition on that side of the property, you might consider a modified pier foundation rather than the continuous perimeter shown in these drawings. Less concrete, better drainage, and potentially more stable during freeze-thaw cycles. His suggestion was thoughtful and offered in the spirit of collaboration rather than directive. It represented his genuine expertise from years in construction while acknowledging my decision-making authority for the project. That makes perfect sense, I agreed. Would you be willing to review the revised foundation plans when they're ready? Your practical experience would be valuable. I'd be happy to, he replied, a note of pleasure evident in his voice. It's good to feel useful again. This simple exchange illustrated the transformation underway, a shift from the hierarchical parent-child dynamic that had persisted inappropriately into my adulthood toward a more balanced relationship between adults with different but complementary areas of expertise. My father was offering knowledge without presuming control, I was receiving his input without surrendering autonomy. As April progressed into May, these small but significant interactions accumulated, gradually replacing the tension of the previous months with something approaching genuine collaboration. The usage agreement remained in place, but its implementation felt increasingly natural rather than forced, a framework that provided clarity rather than a restrictive set of rules. One evening, as I sat on the deck watching the sunset, I realized that the painful confrontation over the lake house had catalyzed necessary growth, not just in my family relationships, but in my own approach to life more broadly. By finally standing, firm on matters of personal boundaries and self-respect, I had initiated a transformation that extended far beyond property rights. The challenge had never been primarily about the house itself, but about establishing authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited patterns that no longer served anyone well. The property had simply provided the tangible focus for addressing deeper issues that had influenced our family interactions for decades. As darkness settled over the lake and stars began appearing in the clear spring sky, I felt a sense of quiet, accomplishment. The path forward wasn't perfectly clear or without potential complications, but we had established a foundation for healthier interaction than what had come before. That foundation, built on honest communication, appropriate boundaries, and recognition of each person's legitimate needs, offered the potential for relationships of genuine substance rather than superficial harmony maintained through uneven sacrifice. The lake house remained mine in legal and practical terms, but its meaning had evolved. Rather than representing either my individual achievement or a contested family resource, it was becoming something more nuanced, a shared space where healthy boundaries actually enhanced meaningful connection, demonstrating that respect and generosity could coexist without exploitation or entitlement. Late June brought perfect summer weather to Cedar Springs. The lake sparkled in brilliant azure under cloudless skies, and the gardens surrounding my property had exploded into a riot of color, perennials I'd planted over the years finally reaching their full potential. As my father's birthday celebration approached, I found myself actually looking forward to hosting extended family at the lake house for the first time since the previous winter's confrontation. My parents had honored the scheduling system meticulously, confirming dates, communicating their plans, and even requesting permission before inviting additional guests. This seemingly small adjustment represented a profound shift in our dynamics. Their recognition of my authority regarding the property demonstrated through consistent actions rather than merely verbal acknowledgments. I arrived at the lake house 3 days before the scheduled celebration to prepare the property and implement some special touches for the occasion. The morning after my arrival, I was surprised to hear a vehicle coming up the drive. My mother stepped out alone, an unusual occurrence as my parents typically traveled together, particularly to the lake. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her tentative tone revealing lingering uncertainty about the new boundaries. "I thought I might help with preparations, but I should have called first." "You're always welcome, Mom," I assured her, "especially when you're helping with party preparations." Relief softened her features as she retrieved several shopping bags from her car. "I brought some decorations and photo albums for a display table. Nothing extravagant, but Thomas deserves a proper celebration for 75. We worked companionably in the great room, arranging photographs chronicling my father's life, his childhood in rural Michigan, wedding photos from the early 1970s, images of him holding Marcus and me as infants, and recent pictures with his grandchildren. The activity provided natural opportunity for conversation that gradually moved beyond superficial topics. "I've been meaning to thank you," my mother said, as she carefully positioned a photo of my father, teaching a young Jacob to cast a fishing line, "for being willing to host this gathering after everything that happened. It means a great deal to your father, though he'd never say so directly." "The lake house has always been meant for family enjoyment," I replied. "That hasn't changed. even if the parameters needed adjustment. She nodded thoughtfully, selecting another photograph from the collection. Looking back, I can see how our behavior must have appeared to you. Taking over spaces, making changes without asking, treating your property as communal without contributing proportionally. She shook her head slightly. At the time, it just seemed like normal family interaction, the way we'd always operated. This candid acknowledgement surprised me. My mother had historically been the most resistant to examining family patterns, preferring to maintain comfortable narratives even when they contradicted observable reality. "What changed your perspective?" I asked. She arranged a few more photographs before responding. "Several things, actually. Watching your father struggle, with feeling that he'd somehow damaged his relationship with you, was difficult. Then Marcus shared some insights from conversations with Vanessa about family systems and boundary patterns." She smiled wryly. "Apparently, we've become a case study in their household discussions." The external perspective Vanessa had provided was evidently influencing multiple family relationships, creating space for reflection that might otherwise have remained closed. "But mostly," my mother continued with unexpected vulnerability, "I started remembering how I felt when my own mother would rearrange my kitchen whenever she visited after your father and I first married. How frustrated I was when she criticized my parenting decisions or made changes to our home without consulting me." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "Somehow, I became exactly the type of mother-in-law and parent I had resented, without even realizing the pattern was repeating." This self-reflection represented significant growth from the defensive posture she had maintained during our initial confrontation. Rather than positioning my boundary setting as an attack on family values, she was beginning to recognize the legitimate need for autonomy and respect that had motivated my stand. "It takes courage to examine those patterns," I acknowledged, "especially when they're so familiar they've become invisible." "I should have recognized it sooner," she said, regret evident in her voice. "When you were growing up, we always prioritized Marcus's preferences, his favorite meals, his activities, his friends. We told ourselves it was because he was more vocal about his needs, but the truth is we created that dynamic by responding differently to each of you from the beginning." This acknowledgement of the differential treatment I had experienced throughout childhood was something I had never expected to hear. The validation of my lived experience, long dismissed whenever I'd attempted to address it, felt surprisingly healing. "As parents, we convinced ourselves we were treating you both equally, just differently according to your personalities," she continued. "But looking at these photographs, I can see so many moments where you're in the background, accommodating everyone else's preferences without complaint. We came to expect that accommodation rather than appreciating it." "I participated in establishing those patterns too," I pointed out. "By never pushing back, I helped normalize the imbalance. Children shouldn't have to push back to receive." "Equal consideration," my mother countered with unexpected firmness. "That was our responsibility as parents, and we failed you in that regard." We continued arranging photographs, the shared activity providing a container for this unprecedented level of honest communication. As we worked, my mother shared memories triggered by various images. Some I recalled, others preserved only through these frozen moments and her narratives. "Your father struggled with expressing his emotions after his own father died," she explained, touching a photograph of him holding me as a toddler, his expression unexpectedly tender. "His dad was the traditional stoic type, never said, 'I love you.' I never showed affection. Thomas was determined to be different with his sons, but old patterns have deep roots." "The tax payments," I said, understanding dawning. "That was his way of expressing care when he couldn't find the words." She nodded. "Exactly. Not the most direct approach, but genuine in its intention. When you establish those boundaries, around the lake house he felt rejected, not just regarding the property, but his attempt to contribute meaningfully to something important to you. This context helped explain the intensity of my father's initial reaction to the usage agreement. What I had intended as establishing basic respect had been experienced by him as rejection of his expression of care, however indirectly communicated. "I wish I had known about the tax payments from the beginning," I said. "It would have changed how I approached the whole situation." "That's the heart of it, isn't it?" my mother observed, surprising me with her insight. So many family conflicts stem from operating with incomplete information. Assumptions about intentions, hidden contributions, unexpressed expectations. We created a perfect environment for misunderstanding by keeping important things unspoken. By mid-afternoon, we had transformed the great room into a celebration of my father's life journey, photographs tastefully arranged alongside meaningful mementos from different phases of his life. As we stepped back to evaluate our work, my mother turned to me with unexpected sincerity. "I'm proud of you, Nathan, not just for your professional success or this beautiful place you've created, but for having the courage to break dysfunctional patterns when the rest of us were content to perpetuate them. It couldn't have been easy standing your ground against our collective resistance." "It wasn't," I acknowledged. I second-guessed myself constantly, wondering if I was overreacting or being unreasonable. "You weren't," she stated firmly. "You were the only one seeing the situation clearly, while the rest of us were operating from entrenched habits rather than conscious choices." This validation from the person who had initially been most critical of my boundary setting felt profoundly affirming. Not because I needed her approval to know I'd made the right decision, but because it signaled genuine evolution in our relationship, movement toward the mutual respect I had been seeking all along. The day of my father's birthday dawned gloriously, with perfect weather for the outdoor celebration we had planned. Marcus and his family arrived early to help with final preparations, setting up additional seating on the expanded deck and assembling the new gas grill I had purchased specifically for the occasion. My father appeared genuinely moved when he arrived to find the property transformed in his honor, from the photo display chronicling his life to the carefully selected menu featuring his favorite foods. What seemed to affect him most deeply, however, was the collaborative nature of the event. The way family members had worked together respectfully to create something meaningful, rather than through the haphazard, often conflicting approaches that had characterized previous gatherings. During a quiet moment while others were engaged in various activities, my father joined me at the edge of the property, where foundation work for the guest cabin had recently begun. "Your mother tells me you found a contractor who specializes in energy-efficient small structures," he commented, examining the initial site work with an expert eye. "Yes, they're incorporating several sustainable building practices," I confirmed. "Solar orientation, advanced insulation techniques, rainwater collection system." He nodded approvingly. "Smart approaches. Built properly, this cabin could stand for generations." The observation carried meaning beyond construction techniques. We both recognized that what we were rebuilding extended beyond physical structures to the relationship foundations that would support future family interactions. "I wanted to thank you," my father said after a moment, his voice carrying the slight gruffness that always accompanied emotional topics. "Not just for hosting today, but for forcing us to examine patterns we'd fallen into without questioning." "It wasn't easy for any of us," I acknowledged. "Necessary things rarely are," he replied with unexpected wisdom. "Standing your ground took courage, the kind I should have demonstrated years ago when similar patterns emerged in my own relationships." As the celebration continued into early evening, I observed the subtle but significant shifts in family dynamics. My mother, consulting me before rearranging serving dishes on the buffet table, Marcus actively involving me in conversations rather than speaking over or for me, my father openly acknowledging my expertise regarding the property he had once criticized as an extravagance. These changes might seem inconsequential to outside observers, but they represented profound evolution in relationships that had operated on unexamined autopilot for decades. The crisis precipitated by my boundary setting had ultimately created opportunity for growth that might otherwise never have occurred. As twilight settled over the lake and guests began departing, I found myself sitting on the dock with Emma, who had been unusually quiet throughout the day. "Is everything okay?" I asked, as she dangled her feet in the water beside mine. "I've been thinking about something," she replied with the seriousness only a 10-year-old contemplating life's complexities can muster, about the lake house and families and rules. "That's some pretty big thinking," I observed. "Want to share?" "When you first made the rules about the lake house, everyone was mad," she stated matter-of-factly. "But now everyone seems happier when we're here. How does that work?" Her observation cut to the heart of the paradox we had navigated, how appropriate limitations could actually enhance rather than restrict meaningful connection. "Sometimes," I explained carefully, "clear boundaries help people understand how to interact respectfully with each other. When expectations are clear, it creates safety and trust." She considered this thoughtfully. "Like how I know exactly when I can use your art supplies and where to put them when I'm finished." "Exactly like that," I confirmed, impressed by her understanding. "When we know the rules and they make sense, we can relax and enjoy ourselves without worrying about doing something wrong accidentally." Emma nodded, evidently satisfied with this explanation. "I'm glad you made the rules, Uncle Nathan. The lake house feels more special now, like an important place we need to take care of together." Her simple articulation captured precisely what I had been attempting to create. Not exclusion or control, but a shared understanding of value that enhanced rather than diminished our collective experience of the property. As stars began appearing, in the darkening sky, I realized that the difficult boundary-setting process had ultimately created something more valuable than peaceful access to my property. It had catalyzed a transformation in family dynamics that extended far beyond practical arrangements regarding the lake house, initiating a journey toward more authentic, respectful relationships built on mutual consideration rather than entrenched habits or unexamined expectations. The celebration had demonstrated that healthy boundaries didn't diminish meaningful connection, but rather created the necessary foundation for it to flourish. By standing firm on matters of personal respect and appropriate limits, I had ultimately helped facilitate not separation, but a deeper, more sustainable form of togetherness, one built on choice and mutual regard rather than obligation or entitlement. By early August, construction on the guest cabin had progressed significantly. The foundation was complete, the framing had been erected, and the roof was nearly finished, its cedar shingles matching the main house while incorporating modern, energy-efficient elements beneath the traditional exterior. Standing on the newly installed deck that extended toward the lake, I could envision how this thoughtfully designed space would enhance family gatherings for years to come. The cabin represented more than just additional accommodation. It symbolized the evolution of my approach to sharing the lake property. Rather than reacting defensively to boundary violations, I had chosen to create a constructive solution that addressed everyone's needs: private space for guests, reduced pressure on the main house, and maintained boundaries that preserved my own sanctuary. This proactive investment reflected a broader shift in my perspective. The painful confrontation over the lake house had initially felt like a battle to protect what was mine, but it had evolved into something more nuanced, an opportunity to create sustainable systems for shared enjoyment that respected everyone's legitimate needs, including my own. My cell phone rang as I was reviewing the electrical installation with the contractor. It was Vanessa, which was unusual. Our improved relationship typically involved communication through Marcus rather than direct contact. "Nathan, I'm so sorry to bother you," she began, tension evident in her voice. "There's been a situation with Marcus. My immediate concern was for his safety. Is he all right?" "Physically, yes," she clarified quickly. But he's been laid off from Henderson Manufacturing. The company was acquired by a conglomerate, and they've eliminated his entire department. This news was surprising and concerning. Marcus had been with Henderson for over 15 years, rising to operations manager for their regional distribution center. The position had provided stability for his family and formed a central part of his identity. "That's terrible," I said sincerely. "How's he handling it?" "Not well," Vanessa admitted. "He's been either completely withdrawn or irritable with the kids. I suggested he talk to you, but he's, let me guess, too proud to reach out?" "Exactly. He keeps saying he'll figure it out on his own. But I'm worried about him. This isn't just about income. It's shaken his confidence completely." I understood Marcus's reaction. Despite our improving relationship, certain aspects of masculinity remained deeply ingrained in his self-concept, particularly providing for his family and maintaining the appearance of control during crisis. "What can I do to help?" I asked. Vanessa hesitated before responding. "I had an idea, but I'm not sure how you'll feel about it. The kids start school in 3 weeks. I was wondering if Marcus could stay at the lake house for a few days, just to decompress and get his head straight before tackling the job search. I'd stay here with the children to maintain their routine." The request was reasonable and exactly the type of scenario my new boundaries had been designed to accommodate: scheduled access for specific purposes rather than assumed availability. Yet I sensed Vanessa's uncertainty stemmed from the history of conflict surrounding the property. "Of course he can use the lake house," I assured her. "It's an ideal place to regroup. I'll check the calendar and text you the available dates." "Thank you, Nathan. And if you could make it seem like your idea rather than mine. His pride is pretty battered right now." I understood the delicate male ego dynamics at play. "Leave it to me. I've been meaning to connect with him anyway." After consulting my schedule, I called Marcus directly that evening, purposely avoiding any mention of Vanessa's call. "Hey, I could use your input on the guest cabin's interior layout," I began casually. "I'll be at the city office all next week, but the property's available if you want to check on the construction progress and give me your thoughts." His initial hesitation was palpable. "I'm pretty busy with work stuff right now." "No pressure," I replied, keeping my tone light while creating an opportunity he could accept without losing face. "The cabin keys are in the usual lockbox if you find yourself with some free time. Might be nice to enjoy the lake while it's quiet, before the Labor Day crowd descends." 2 days later, I received a text. "Taking you up on the lake house offer. Could use a few days to clear my head. We'll send cabin feedback." I responded with practical information about the property status and a casual, "enjoy the peace and quiet," careful not to acknowledge the professional crisis that had prompted his visit. Some forms of support are most effective when delivered indirectly, particularly between men raised in families where vulnerability was equated with weakness. Midway through the following week, I received another text from Marcus with several photographs of the guest cabin interior and thoughtful suggestions about storage configurations. The message ended with, "Place is helping me think straight again. Thanks." The brief acknowledgement spoke volumes about his state of mind and the therapeutic effect of the lake environment. I responded with appreciation for his cabin insights and deliberately avoided inquiring about his job situation, respecting his need to approach that topic on his terms. When Friday arrived, I decided to drive to the lake house after work, rather than waiting until the following morning, as originally planned. Marcus's scheduled departure was Saturday, and I wanted to connect in person without making him feel monitored or pressured. I arrived to find him seated on the dock, watching the sunset with a beer in hand. The scene struck me as both peaceful and slightly melancholic, a man finding temporary respite from difficult realities he would soon have to face again. "Hope you don't mind company," I said, settling into the adjacent Adirondack chair I had installed earlier that summer. "Your house," he replied with a hint of his usual dry humor. Pretty sure that means you're never actually company. Fair point. I accepted the beer he offered from the small cooler between the chairs. How's the cabin coming along? This neutral topic provided comfortable entree into conversation, allowing Marcus to engage without immediately confronting more sensitive subjects. We discussed construction details and design decisions as twilight deepened around us, the lake's surface transitioning from sun-dappled gold to mysterious indigo. When natural pauses lengthened between topics, I sensed Marcus gathering himself to address what had brought him to the lake house. I waited patiently, giving him space to approach difficult subjects at his own pace. I got laid off, he finally stated, gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. 15 years at Henderson, and it ends with a 30-minute meeting and a standardized severance package. I heard, I acknowledged. That's rough. He glanced at me sharply. Vanessa called you. She was concerned, I confirmed, seeing no benefit in pretending otherwise. But I would have offered the lake house regardless. It's a good place to regroup. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. I should have seen it coming. There were signs, consultants examining operational efficiencies, rumors about the acquisition. I just never thought it would affect my department. We were consistently profitable. Corporate restructuring rarely follows logical patterns. I offered. It's not a reflection on your performance. Try telling that to my mortgage company, he replied with a bitter edge, or the kids' private school tuition office. The financial anxiety underlying his professional disappointment was evident. Marcus and Vanessa had built a comfortable lifestyle that suddenly seemed precarious, threatening not just their material security, but his identity as provider and protector. What's your next step? I asked. I've updated my resume, started reaching out to industry contacts. He sighed heavily. But manufacturing management positions at my level are scarce in this region. I might need to consider relocation, which Vanessa isn't thrilled about with the kids established in their schools and activities. The prospect of geographic displacement added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation. While I had created my career in financial services with mobility in mind, Marcus had built his life around stability and community roots. Have you considered other industries where your operations experience would transfer? I suggested. Distribution. Centers, supply chain management, logistics coordination. Your skills aren't limited to manufacturing environments. Maybe, he conceded, though his tone suggested limited confidence in this approach. The problem is breaking into new sectors without direct experience. Everyone wants candidates who've already done exactly the job they're hiring for. We continued discussing options and strategies as night fully enveloped the lake, stars emerging in spectacular profusion above the water. The conversation had a different quality than our previous interactions. More equal, more vulnerable on both sides, free from the competitive undertones that had historically characterized our relationship. There's something else, Marcus eventually admitted, his voice quieter. Something I haven't even told Vanessa. He took a deep breath before continuing. I've been thinking about starting my own business for years, a specialized logistics consulting firm focused on regional manufacturing operations. I developed systems at Henderson that consistently outperformed industry standards, but never received appropriate recognition or compensation for those innovations. This revelation surprised me. Marcus had always seemed content with the security of corporate employment rather than entrepreneurial risk. Why haven't you pursued it? Fear, mostly, he acknowledged with unusual candor. The stability of a regular paycheck, benefits, established structures. It's comfortable, even when frustrating. Vanessa's teaching salary alone wouldn't cover our expenses during a startup phase, and I've never had sufficient capital to launch properly without income interruption. His situation resonated with me unexpectedly. Though our career paths had diverged significantly, I recognized the tension between security and aspiration that had shaped my own professional choices. My purchase of the lake house had represented my resolution of that tension, choosing calculated risk in service of deeper values rather than defaulting to comfortable limitations. "What would you need to launch successfully?" I asked, an idea beginning to form. Marcus looked surprised by the question, as if he hadn't expected practical engagement with what he'd framed as an unrealistic dream. Realistically, about 6 months of operating expenses covered while establishing client relationships, office space, basic administrative support, professional website and materials, maybe $75,000 total to do it properly. I considered this figure, substantial but not excessive for a business launch with genuine potential. "Would you be open to discussing this more formally, perhaps putting together a proper business plan with financial projections?" "Why?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because I might be interested in investing," I stated simply. Marcus stared at me, clearly struggling to process this unexpected response. "You can't be serious. After everything that happened with the lake house, that's precisely why I'm considering it," I interrupted. "The lake house situation taught me important lessons about boundaries. Yes, but also about investment, financial and emotional. If your business concept is sound and your expertise is valuable, it could be a worthwhile opportunity." "But we're family," he protested. "Wouldn't that complicate things?" "Only if we approach it without clear parameters," I explained. "We would establish explicit terms, expectations, and boundaries from the beginning, just as we did with the lake house. The difference is we'd be creating those guidelines proactively rather than reactively after problems developed." As we discussed this possibility further, I could see Marcus's perspective shifting, from viewing his job loss as devastating failure to considering it a potential catalyst for long-deferred ambitions. Our conversation extended late into the night, exploring both practical considerations and the psychological dimensions of such a significant transition. "I need to think about this," Marcus finally said as we walked back toward the house. "And discuss it with Vanessa, of course, but I appreciate the consideration more than I can express. It means a lot that you'd even contemplate investing in my capabilities." "That's what healthy family relationships should involve," I replied. "Supporting each other's growth while maintaining appropriate boundaries and expectations. It took us a while to figure that out, but perhaps we're finally getting there." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how profoundly the lake house confrontation had transformed our family dynamics. What had begun as a painful boundary dispute had evolved into increased mutual respect, more authentic communication, and now potentially a constructive business partnership based on clearly defined parameters rather than assumed entitlements. The guest cabin under construction represented this transformation in physical form, connected to the main house but distinctly separate, with clear boundaries that enhanced rather than restricted meaningful interaction. Similarly, a potential investment in Marcus's business would establish a new model for family support, one built on explicit agreements and shared understanding rather than unexamined expectations or one-sided sacrifice. This evolution wasn't just about family harmony. It reflected a fundamental shift in how I engaged with life more broadly. Rather than accommodating unreasonable demands to maintain surface peace, I had learned to establish boundaries that created space for genuine connection. Instead of avoiding conflict at any cost, I had discovered that addressing underlying issues directly, though initially painful, could ultimately create more authentic and sustainable relationships. The lake house had become not just a physical sanctuary, but the catalyst for profound personal growth, teaching lessons about self-respect, clear communication, and the possibility of transforming even the most entrenched relational patterns when approached with courage and clarity. September brought subtle transitions to Cedar Springs, hints of amber and crimson appearing among the predominantly green foliage surrounding the lake, morning mist lingering longer over the water's surface, and a distinct crispness to the evening air that hadn't been present during August's humidity. The seasonal shift mirrored the continuing evolution in my family relationships and personal growth. Marcus had spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive business plan for his logistics consulting venture, which he'd named Precision Operations Partners. The document reflected both his substantial industry expertise and the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his professional advancement. Revenue projections were conservative yet promising, with clear identification of potential clients drawn from his extensive network of manufacturing contacts. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a private room at Westlake Financial Center, rather than either of our homes, to discuss the potential investment arrangement. This deliberate choice of venue established the professional nature of our discussion, while acknowledging the personal relationship that necessitated additional boundary clarity. "I've reviewed your business plan," I began after we had settled at the conference table, "and I'm impressed with both the concept and the execution. Your market analysis is particularly thorough, and the service offerings align well with identified industry pain points." Marcus nodded, accepting the professional assessment without the dismissive attitude that might have characterized his response to my input in previous years. "I've been considering this concept for nearly 5 years, refining the approach based on actual operational challenges I've encountered and solved." "That practical experience is your strongest asset," I agreed. "Now let's discuss how we might structure an investment arrangement that respects both business necessities and our family relationship." Over the next 2 hours, we negotiated terms that would provide Marcus with the capital needed to launch properly, while establishing clear expectations regarding my involvement, return parameters, and exit strategies. The conversation had a remarkable quality of mutual respect, acknowledging both his expertise in operations and my financial acumen without the competitive undertones that had historically characterized our interactions. "I'm proposing a 2-tier investment," I explained, outlining the approach I had developed after careful consideration. "The first tier would be a straightforward business investment of $50,000 in exchange for a 20% equity stake in Precision Operations Partners, with clear valuation metrics for potential future buyout options." Marcus reviewed the proposed terms, nodding thoughtfully. "That seems fair. And the second tier?" "The second tier would be structured as a personal loan of $25,000 with favorable terms, prime rate interest, and a 5-year repayment schedule beginning after the company reaches specified revenue benchmarks. This separates family support from business investment, creating distinct agreements for each aspect of our arrangement." "I appreciate that distinction," Marcus acknowledged. "It keeps the boundaries clear between personal and professional relationships." This observation revealed how profoundly our interaction patterns had evolved. The same person who had previously resisted basic boundaries regarding property usage now recognized the value of clear delineation between different aspects of our connection. The lake house confrontation had catalyzed growth that extended far beyond property considerations into fundamental principles of healthy relationships. "There's one more element I'd like to propose," I continued. "The guest cabin at the lake will be completed by late October. I'd like to offer it as a designated workspace for Precision Operations Partners during the initial launch phase, providing professional meeting space without the immediate overhead of commercial office leasing." Marcus looked genuinely surprised by this offer. "That would be tremendously helpful. Are you sure it wouldn't infringe on your usage plans for the property?" "I've thought through the practical implications," I assured him. "The cabin has separate access from the main house and dedicated parking. We would establish a clear scheduling system for client meetings to ensure privacy and prevent calendar conflicts. It's a resource I can provide that delivers significant value without actual capital outlay." His expression reflected a complex mixture of gratitude and something approaching wonder at how our relationship had transformed. "A year ago, I would have simply assumed access to the lake house for any purpose I deemed necessary," he admitted, Now I recognize what a significant offer this represents, and the thought you've invested in making it work for everyone involved. That's exactly it, I acknowledged. The issue was never about sharing resources, but about establishing parameters that respected everyone's legitimate needs and contributions. This arrangement accomplishes that, creating clear boundaries, while facilitating meaningful support. As we concluded our meeting with handshakes and signed term sheets, I felt profound satisfaction in the evolution we had achieved, from contentious conflict over property usage to collaborative partnership built on mutual respect and explicit agreements. The transformation hadn't eliminated our differences or erased our history, but it had created a framework within which those elements could coexist with present-day health and future growth. The following weekend, Trevor contacted me about an unexpected maintenance issue at the lake house. A significant leak had developed in the main water line connecting the property to the municipal system. The repair would require extensive excavation across the front portion of the property, disrupting the landscaping I had carefully developed over the years. The plumber estimates 3 to 5 days of work, Trevor reported. They'll need to bring in heavy equipment to access the line properly. It's going to create quite a mess initially, though they've promised to restore the disturbed areas as much as possible. This development was frustrating but unavoidable. Water infrastructure wasn't something that could be deferred or partially addressed. I arranged to take several days away from the office to oversee the repair process and ensure minimal damage to the property's aesthetic appeal. When I arrived at Cedar Springs, I discovered my father had also made the trip, having heard about the situation from my mother, who remained in close contact with Trevor regarding property matters. "Thought you might need an extra set of eyes," he explained when I found him evaluating the proposed excavation route with the plumbing contractor. "These guys sometimes take shortcuts that create bigger problems down the road." Rather than perceiving his presence as interference, I recognized it as the genuine offer of assistance it represented. My father's construction background provided practical expertise I lacked, particularly regarding infrastructure systems and contractor oversight. "I appreciate the help," I said sincerely. "This isn't exactly my area of expertise." Together, we negotiated modifications to the excavation plan that would minimize impact on the mature landscaping while ensuring complete resolution of the waterline issue. My father's technical questions revealed potential complications the contractor hadn't initially addressed, resulting in a more comprehensive approach to the repair. They were planning to replace just the damaged section, he explained as we reviewed the revised proposal. But given the age of this infrastructure, that would likely lead to cascading failures in other portions of the line within a few years. Better to address the entire system from property boundary to house connection now, even if it's more disruptive initially. His analysis perfectly captured the essence of wise property stewardship. Sometimes addressing problems comprehensively creates temporary inconvenience, but prevents recurring issues that ultimately cause greater disruption and expense. The principle applied equally well to relationship dynamics, where addressing root causes rather than symptoms might create initial discomfort, but ultimately produces more sustainable resolutions. As the excavation work proceeded over subsequent days, my father and I established an effective collaboration pattern. He providing technical oversight of the contractors while I handled logistics, documentation, and neighbor communications regarding the temporary disruptions. The process created natural opportunities for extended conversation as we monitored progress together. "Your mother mentioned Marcus is starting his own business," he commented as we watched the backhoe operator carefully navigating between established trees. "Quite a transition after 15 years with Henderson." "It's a significant change," I acknowledged, "but one that leverages his expertise while offering greater autonomy and potential rewards." My father nodded thoughtfully. "And you're involved in the venture?" "As an investor, yes," I confirmed. "We've established clear parameters regarding my financial participation and his operational authority." "Smart approach," he observed, genuine approval in his tone. Mixing family and business requires explicit boundaries to succeed. After a brief pause, he added, I wish I'd understood that principle earlier in life. Might have prevented some painful situations with my own brother when we tried working together after your grandfather died. This reference to family history I knew only vaguely. A failed business partnership between my father and his brother that had created a rift lasting nearly a decade revealed how our recent experiences had prompted his own reflection on past relationship patterns. What happened with Uncle Robert? I asked, genuinely curious about this rarely mentioned chapter of family history. My father sighed, watching the excavation work while organizing his thoughts. We inherited Dad's construction company together. Equal ownership, but very different. Visions for its future. I wanted to modernize, expand into commercial projects, establish systematic business practices. Robert preferred the familiar approach: residential work, handshake agreements, operations centering on his personal relationships with subcontractors. The fundamental conflict he described resonated with many family business scenarios. Different. Perspectives colliding without established mechanisms for resolution. We never clearly defined decision-making authority or created explicit agreements about operational approaches, he continued. Just assumed our shared blood would somehow magically align our business philosophies. He shook his head ruefully. The company survived, but our relationship nearly didn't. Took years to rebuild basic trust after I eventually sold my interest to him. This candid sharing of his own difficult experience represented significant evolution in our relationship, moving from the traditional father-knows-best approach toward more authentic exchange between adults with different but complementary areas of wisdom. That's precisely what Marcus and I are trying to avoid, I explained. We've created detailed agreements covering everything from initial investment parameters to eventual exit strategies. The lake house situation taught us both the importance of explicit understanding rather than assumed alignment. You've learned faster than I did, my father acknowledged, his tone conveying genuine respect rather than the dismissiveness that might once have characterized his response to my perspectives. Took me losing a relationship with my only brother to recognize those principles. As the waterline replacement progressed, requiring significant portions of the front landscape to be temporarily disrupted, I found unexpected parallels between this infrastructure project and the personal growth journey the lake house had facilitated. In both cases, addressing fundamental systems required disruptive excavation, exposing hidden connections, removing damaged components, and installing new structures capable of supporting future needs. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.